Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Gary Mond. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the chairman of the National Jewish Assembly, and it's my very great pleasure tonight to have as our guest speaker Zia Yusuf, who's the director of Reform UK. And I'm going to introduce you in a moment. But first, I just want to say to everyone, if you want to ask questions, please, 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 can you put up your virtual hands? And to do that, you go to the bottom of the screen where it says raise hand and click on that. Also, you can ask questions in the chat room. Indeed, what we're doing tonight is that the chat will only be directed to the organisers, so that way we don't lose your questions. But first priority will be given to those who do put up their virtual hands. Okay, so our guest speaker this evening is Zia Yusuf. Zia is a board member of Reform UK. He's the head of the Department of Government Efficiency at Reform UK and previously served as Reform UK's chairman. He's one of Reform UK's leading spokesmen in the media. He appears very regularly on most TV channels and in other media outlets. He talks about the economy, he talks about tax, he talks about immigration, he talks about net zero, and he talks about the wasteful spending of local authorities, and indeed many other topics as well. Before Zia entered politics, he was a highly successful businessman. After graduating from the London School of Economics, Zia worked at Merrill Lynch and also at Goldman Sachs, where he rose to become an executive director of the bank. He then founded a luxury concierge company, Velocity Black, which was sold to Capital One in 2023. It's my great pleasure to welcome Zia to the National Jewish Assembly. Over to you, Zia.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you for having me. It is a pleasure and an honor to be here. Thank you all 132 of you so far who have taken the trouble out of your evening to come listen to this. So I really appreciate it. As Gary said, there's obviously opportunity for questions. I'm happy to make this pretty interactive. So if you have questions, depending on how many hands go up, I'll attenuate my opening remarks to try to make sure that we get through as many questions as we can in the time that we have. So look, it's a very interesting time for the country. It is a time without precedent, I would say, in British politics. We are very proud of what we've achieved at Reform. I've only been in politics for about 14 and a half months now. Feels like a lot longer, I can assure you. But obviously, Nigel coming back into politics. If you remember back in June last year, Nigel was retired from politics, if you remember, and the Tories were still sort of polling at 25%. And obviously a lot has changed since then. And, we've gone from that beachhead in Parliament where we won 5 seats in the House of Commons and 14% vote share to today, where the latest 2 polls put us at 34 and 35%, respectively, on the back of the announcement we had last week of Operation Restoring Justice, where we laid out how we would deport everyone who's in the country illegally in Nigel's first term as Prime Minister. So Nigel is now the bookmaker's favourite to be the next Prime Minister of the country. We're still sadly quite a long way from a general election. We take nothing for granted, but we are extremely concerned about the state of the country in many different respects. The state of the economy, the financial hardship that many are going through, but also the social fabric of the country. More than ever, the country feels so well. Certainly, let me be clear, in my lifetime, I don't remember a time when the country has felt like such a tinderbox. And I know from speaking to many Jewish people throughout the country how unsafe a lot of Jewish people feel. And I want to talk about a couple of aspects there, both in the physical real world, as it were, and then also talk a little bit about what's happening on social media. Just before while we were in the waiting room, we were having a brief discussion about the, frankly, again, unprecedented levels of anti-Semitism that seem to be awash on social media feeds these days, particularly X. I want to talk a little bit about that too. Now, one of the things that Reform feels extremely strongly about is that the law must be applied evenly and without fear nor favor. Now, we have been very concerned about the gradual creeping authoritarianism that has appeared over the last couple of decades that have impeded British people's freedom of speech. We think freedom of speech is critically important. And obviously, Britain doesn't have a written constitution, so there is no, enshrined in your constitution right to free speech as does exist in the United States of America. Neither, by the way, is there the enshrined freedom of religion in that same way. I get that there are English common law principles, and we can go back to the Magna Carta, but sadly, we do not have in this country the robustness and the durability of a written constitution. And that does spell some danger in this country. You will know that it's been in the news recently that this Online Safety Act, which we think is a quite Orwellian name, has been used to clamp down on political dissent, and there's plenty of evidence for that. And we're also very worried that you're probably aware of the attempts by this Labour government to bring in a blasphemy law through the back door of an Islamic outlawing, quote unquote, Islamophobia. And I say this as a Muslim myself, no religion should be beyond criticism. But ultimately, all that will do, if you combine that with the Online Safety Act, which will only compound the sense of two-tieredness around both our policing and our justice system, again, both in the real world, in the physical world, and online. And so if we continue to have a government in this country, and we've had successive governments that have just chosen to quite willfully ignore voters, disregard their concerns, then the country is going to get less and less stable. And that is what we are seeing. And that is compounded, of course, by the moribund state of the economy that is also gradually, if you look at our 30-year bond yields now, UK gilts, they are at multi-decade highs, close to 6% now. Britain pays more to finance to finance its debt than both America and even Greece now. So it is a very challenging time for the country. When we think about the political discourse, which is something that Gary asked me to talk about today, I think it's a very difficult time because, as I said, we feel very strongly that freedom of speech is important, and the context for that is as I said, creeping authoritarianism that has meant that, for example, you may have seen in the news just yesterday, one of the creators of Father Ted was arrested by no less than 5 armed police officers upon landing back here in this country for some tweets, and none of those tweets could be interpreted as directly insightful in any way, regardless of whether or not you agree with the content and the substance of those tweets. The deploying of armed officers to make that arrest, I think, is a massive, massive concern. And we all know, any student of history, as I know you all are, will know how these things creep and they creep and they creep very gradually. And then before you know it, perfectly legitimate political dissent is crushed. So we are very concerned about that. But I also want to say I'm equally concerned about, when I open my X feed, the extraordinary amount of anti-Semitism that is now rife on that platform, partly because of the way modern day social media algorithms can be weaponized. So I don't think I've ever seen, I'd be interested to, maybe we could have a show of hands if you agree with this statement. I have never seen in my lifetime such preponderant anti-Semitism on social media, to such a degree that it's really noticeable. It's really abhorrent. Yeah. So we got quite a number of people raising their hands, and I think this really matters because we're living in this situation where a video of a Hitler speech being dubbed. You may have seen these. They sort of, this AI dubbing into English in sort of a German accent can get millions and millions and millions of views. You have some of these talking heads in America that are getting enormous amounts of views on X, huge reach through that platform, with extremely anti-Semitic views. Again, this is not just sort of somebody criticizing an Israeli policy or something. This is abhorrent, clear-cut, quite outrageous actually, and terrifying anti-Semitism. And so, look, moderation on social media, I say this as someone who builds a tech company, it is a difficult problem. I get that. It is a difficult problem. But, and I want to preface all of what I'm saying by with the fact I think Elon Musk is an amazing entrepreneur. Certainly as an entrepreneur myself, he's a hero, and I think he did a great service to all of us by buying X. However, as I said, it really does worry me, the speed at which anti-Semitism has become rife on social media, and I think we are starting to see some of that now start to seep through into real-world actions. So I think that is a very difficult problem. When Elon first bought, I was talking to some of my friends in the tech world in America about this issue. You know, I think freedom of speech is important. Obviously, there are limits to that. But one of the things Elon kept saying when he arrived, when he bought Twitter, he kept saying, freedom of freedom of speech is not, it doesn't mean freedom of reach, if that makes sense. And for, I don't know exactly how the perfect answer to solve these problems, but it definitely feels like, at the very least, I as a user should be able to inform the app that that's not something that I ever want to see. And what worries me is that more and more people are getting their news, forming their view of the world, particularly young people, through these social media platforms, and it is a concern. And look, as someone who's in the front line of British politics over the last 14 months, I think I've got a reasonable claim to the title of the person who's received probably the most abuse on social media, including of a racist sort. Not all of it. And I want to be clear, by the way, that having a go at online at frontline politicians is part and parcel of the game of politics, and people must be able to do that. But obviously, a lot of it has been unpleasantly racist. But again, I think that the speed and scale of the growth in anti-Semitic content on these platforms, and my friends in America say the same thing, I think is a cause for concern. And then when we look at the physical world, we look at the world of you look at the way the police forces police marches, a pro-Palestine march, for example. Frequently, there are chants made on those marches supporting prescribed terrorist organizations, where the police do not move in and make arrests there and then, when they certainly do that when other sorts of protests occur. And again, I think that is a very dangerous thing for any society, when there is this sense that the police are willing to apply the law selectively. And that's the policing side of it. We can then talk more about the justice side too. And so I think the result of this is that certainly the people I speak to in the Jewish community in this country, they don't feel safe. They feel less safe than at any point in recent history in this country. Situation is not getting better. It is getting worse. And so I think that I think that there are some really important conversations to be had around this stuff. Again, freedom of speech is very, very important. We had a Twitter that was rampantly biased and over moderated, obviously, under the old regime, and that was not good. But I think what we have now, without any form of even the user being able to draw some boundaries around what they do and do not want to see, this is really problematic. And I think the situation in Israel with regards to the war, obviously after this horrific attacks, which sadly many seem to have forgotten about now, certainly if you watch the media. I think often people a conversation that might begin about a policy position for the state of Israel, again, as a result of these algorithms, descends very, very quickly into pretty disgusting and obvious anti-Semitism. So, what can a reform government do? I think one of the things that we are committed to is ending two-tier policing, ensuring that the law is applied evenly and fairly. If there are some young men in a car driving alongside some elderly Jewish people and shouting horrific things at them, those people need to be arrested and dealt with just like they would be if there were any other group. And I think that there seems to be a well-founded concern amongst the Jewish community that they are that two-tier policing. I don't think anyone is more on the wrong end of that two-tier policing than the Jewish community. So, I think that we've got a very good chance of doing that. We've got some excellent people. We've already got Colin Sutton, a brilliant police officer who is heading up our law and order task force. We're working on legislation to make sure that is done. I think a lot of it is about the culture in the police force. It's making sure we have the right management teams, the right incentives. Show me the incentives, I'll show you the outcomes, as Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's business partner, used to say. I think we've got to sort this out. And I think it is a real canary in the coal mine for any society when Jewish people feel as unsafe as they do now, and where many, sadly, are now have either already left or are seriously considering leaving. I can't think of a more dangerous canary in the coal mine than that. So let me pause there. I think we've got a number of hands up, Gary, and we can go to questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Zia. I will just kick off with the first question on the Reform UK's plans to abolish the Online Safety Act. If you could explain clearly why Reform UK wants to do that, and also if you could counter the opposing arguments, generally coming from the political left, who think that its abolition will lead to an increase in not just anti-Semitism, but anti-Muslim hatred, and essentially more attacks on minorities. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the Online Safety Act and your plans to abolish it.
Yeah, well, look, the clearest rebuttal to that is look what's happening on social media at the moment. What is happening is, transcripts of court cases of the rape gangs, where there was systematic cover up and abuse of young girls in this country, were being censored, right? We're seeing people trying to use Xbox Live being forced to verify their age. Protests outside a migrant hotel in Leeds, perfectly lawful, legal, peaceful protests outside a migrant hotel in Leeds. Those are being censored. And yet, all the things we just talked about, a Hitler speech dubbed using AI in this sort of glorified format, that's not being censored, right? And so what we're seeing in the you've got to judge legislation not by its intention, but by its outcome. And so if you look at these outcomes, what is happening is it's having a chilling effect on speech, on legitimate political speech. And certainly for where I'm sitting, and I'm reasonably well briefed on this, and so on my team, we are not seeing any evidence that it's having any impact on the things that we on this call I've just been talking about. And so what we're saying is, look, we're going to have to repeal it largely because this act is like 200 pages. And we actually went through it. And there's probably less than 4 pages there that we would keep. So it would be dishonest for us to say, if you're throwing away north of 96% of a document, that's not that is basically disposing of the document. And so we will be producing legislation which will protect children, right? So that's the first thing. And there is no doubt that there are harms on the internet. No doubt about that, right? And there is no doubt that children, the government does have a role to try to mitigate that within reason. And so there are things that we can do to do that. There, from a technical standpoint, it's quite a difficult technical problem if you want to really do this without impeding on civil liberties too much. But one idea we have is a concept called a zero knowledge proof. So this would be a token where no information, it would be issued by the passport office, who already have, of course, your date of birth. It is a token that would be delivered onto a device And all it has, all it does is say whether that person is over 18 or not. There's no other information that is held in that way. It doesn't really impede on civil liberties incrementally because that is delivered by the passport office, already have this information. And that way you can keep children safe. But there are other things inside this legislation which are very, very concerning. One of them is an article which gives a single minister the ability to unilaterally order Ofcom to change the rules without any parliamentary oversight. I mean, that is a CCP style sort of clause. It's very dangerous. And then secondly, there's also the concept of forcing social media companies to censor content and take it down if the content causes, and I quote, non-trivial psychological harm. And who gets to decide what? And this, by the way, is the broad problem with all of these things, right? When we see the stuff that is going on right now on these social media feeds, I sadly, I think that there's a number of MPs inside the House of Commons. I don't want to be careful because I can't prove this, but it's broadly my sense in talking to some of these people and watching what they say. I don't know if they would share the view that even if you just look at some of the, I mean, you've had some MPs, sitting MPs, openly support prescribed organizations, right, with absolutely no consequence whatsoever. So these are, as I said, these are dangerous and unprecedented times. So as a result of all of those things, we think giving a single minister, for example, the ability to unilaterally rewrite the rules, get Ofcom to rewrite the rules, these things are very, very dangerous. And so we will bring legislation and pass legislation that will keep children safe. I think the things we're talking about here, again, these are difficult problems because I think, and one of the biggest issues we have of all is this sense from British people, as I said, that these hate speech laws, the whole concept of hate inside the legal system seems to be used in one direction far more, not universally, but far, far more than in other directions. And I think so this is the interesting thing. It's not always just the legislation. It's also about the culture inside the police force, and indeed issues that I think we have with our judiciary.
Okay, thank you, Zia. Right, I'm delighted to see there are 9 questions so far, in order in which you put your hands up. Mina Bowater, would you go first, and then Jonathan Hoffman? Mina. Are you there, Mina? Unless no. Okay, Jonathan Hoffman.
Hi, Zia. I found myself quite uncomfortable when you're talking about the sort of prevalence of hate on the internet, because look back to the 2024 election. How many Reform candidates had to be dropped because of hate speech? And even the local elections this year, 14 candidates posted hate, according to the Hope Not Hate. Hope Not Hate is not one of my favorite organizations, but 14, they say, of your candidates posted hate. I mean, come on, what you may be top of the opinion polls, but how are you going to get your act together in terms of having decent candidates?
Zia.
So there's a few points I'd make here. Number one, when you're standing thousands of candidates, just the law of probabilities means that unfortunately you're going to have some people who say daft things, some people say unacceptable things. I will tell you that as chairman of the party at the time, it was my responsibility to set up a vetting process, which we did. We vetted thousands and thousands of candidates, and a decent percentage of people didn't pass that vetting because we take a view as to what is the spectrum of things that people say that we think represents reform. And so we could go through the endless examples of candidates from all of the other parties, Labour, the Tories, the Lib Dems, the Green Party. We could go on. So number one, that is unfortunately There's always going to be an element of that when you're standing, it's just the law of big numbers. But you know, there is an underlying point that you're making as well, which makes these conversations very difficult, because as soon as you have a concept, you know, let's use that non-trivial psychological harm, and that concept is sitting actually in many cases in the hands of a minister. You know, often the people who will be making determinations about what that thing is are the last people you would want making that decision. So, you know, we're of the view that that freedom of speech is important, but I think we've done actually, I would argue we've done a pretty remarkable job in a very short period of time, building infrastructure from next to nothing, to be able to field a very, very high quality set of candidates overall. Again, some exceptions, I accept that. It certainly wasn't perfect. But, you know, the proof is in the pudding. You know, we obviously won more seats than either of the two big parties, and I'm very proud of what that achievement and what the councillors continue to do. But, you know, I totally accept our process was not perfect. But, you know, again, such is life.
Mina Bowater, are you now there? Mina?
You hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We can't see you though. Can you turn your camera on if possible? I thought I saw you had it on before, but okay, we've lost you again.
No?
Jean Smith. Jean. Could you come off mute, please, Jean?
Yes. Hi. Well, thank you for coming along tonight, Zia. My question is, it's not that I disagree with anything that you say, but I think ultimately the way we are really going to protect Jews in this country, and I'm not Jewish, is when we actually persuade the British public, rather than being kind of like passively in support of Jewish people, to more actively understand that this is our fight too. And in fact, I'm part of an organization called Our Fight. And so I guess my question to you is, what can reform do to help make the British people realize something that I think they understand instinctively, that, you know, as Netanyahu said, you know, the fight that's going on at the moment by Israel is a fight for Western civilization. And I think because, you know, I've observed a lot of these anti-Israel protests in London, and they, you know, they hide under the cloak of being very pro-Palestinian, blah, 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 blah. But at the end of the day, I don't think you can separate this feeling that Israel is the kind of like the epitome of evil, and as a consequence, Jewish people throughout the world are kind of like the epitome of evil from what's going on in Israel. So I guess my question is, what do you think reform can do, not just in terms of public statements, but to really, and I guess whether or not you agree with that statement, because at the end of the day, if you look at the way things have changed over the past 50 years in terms of the way women are perceived, you know, the way minorities and Black people are perceived, there's a certain amount you can do through legislation, but it's ultimately when the mood of the country changes, that's what really makes the difference. So that, for example, it's not that we need a policeman on every corner, but if a Jewish person is having a problem, then their neighbor comes out and says, look, that's not acceptable here, etc. And we create this movement where it's not acceptable to shout abuse at Jewish people or to attack Jewish people, because the two are very, very connected. People are not pro-Palestinian, they're anti-Israel, and by implication, they're anti every Jewish person in the Middle East. No one's going around attacking Russians because of the Ukraine war. Nobody went around attacking Iraqis during the Iraq War. So this is a particular fight that I think we have going on here.
Zia.
Yeah, look, I think you raise a really interesting point, and I agree with that statement that that's the only way to affect change, and I also agree with the statement that simply, you know, statements coming out on number 10 letterhead paper mean nothing anymore, sadly, for a whole bunch of reasons. Well, certainly they mean less than they have in decades. So I think that it is rare for a political leader to be able to influence culture. It takes a very special politician, political leader to be able to do that. I would put Nigel in that category. I really would. And I think the real answer to that question is that we need a reformed government. We need Nigel in number 10. We need to revivify a sense of national pride in this country again, which can be shared by people from lots of different ethnic backgrounds and religions and faiths. That has been lacking. And not only is that lacking, it has been consistently being eroded, that sense of community, conscious that our slogan is family, community, country. Community, obviously, the bedrock in the middle. I think that's really being lost. And then we need our young people to, especially young people, because I think if you look at where anti-Semitism seems to be most dangerously on the rise, sadly, it does correlate. It is quite inversely correlated with age, right? And there's a whole host of reasons for that. Again, you know, TikTok algorithms and all sorts of things. If you get your news from TikTok, you know, you are going to get a very particular and one-dimensional sense of what is going on in the Middle East. And so how do we get to a stage where, as you said, if there's an elderly Jewish lady being verbally abused, you know, with anti-Semitic comments, that there will be people, you know, neighbors who would come out and assist. Again, I don't, you know, statements from number 10 don't do that, but I think a cultural movement, one that, as I said, creates this sense of shared purpose. You know, I am my brother's keeper, I am my sister's keeper, which transcends, as I said, and this is why I think the nation state is the correct unit for people to have an affinity to. Creating a sense of community like that, I think, is the way to do it. And then we need our young people to be aware of history and to know, again, what such incidents can lead to, and the canary in the coal mine effect that I'm referring to. So it will not be easy, and it takes a really formative political leader to be able to do it, and it will take time, Gene, to do it. But I think that exactly what you're talking about is a very positive externality that comes from what we are genuinely trying to do, which is create a sense of national pride, a sense of commitment to family, and a sense of commitment to community that, as I said, transcends all of those things. And, you know, one of the things that I didn't really cover in my opening remarks that I think is relevant here too, whether you look at, you know, anti-Semitism or any of these forms of highly reductive, oversimplified, you know, sort of totalitarian explanations for things. These are obviously going to be correlated, and you look through history with times when people are economically struggling, right? When they feel the system is working against them, when they feel like they have no opportunity. And, you know, anti-Semitism offers people, you know, young people, this total explanation for so many of the things that ail them, you know, and I think that is one reason why some of these awful ideas are percolating in the way that they are on social media. So again, how do we arrest that? One of the things we have to start addressing those issues. We have to start ensuring that young people have opportunities. We have to get people to understand that, again, they are going to, oh, look, I'm a Muslim in this country. I'm a second generation immigrant. I didn't come from money. One of the reasons I do what I do as a volunteer, pretty much with all of my woken hours, I do it because I love I love this country. I'm incredibly grateful for the opportunities it has given me, and I think I'm a reasonable example of social mobility. And so many people gave me opportunities when they didn't need to. You know, Jewish people, Christian people did that. And so I want that same opportunity set for every young person in this country. And I think that probably more than any, I think there's one of the, again, a massive canary in the coal mine right now, the total lack of social mobility in this country, the total chasm of there's an absolute vacuum of opportunity and hope for young people, which then gives an opportunity for it gives the ability for these for that resentment to be quickly distilled and converted into awful ideas like anti-Semitism. So sorry, very long-winded answer, but I don't think I think all of those things are really fundamental and important. It's what Nigel's dedicated his life to. I've dedicated my life to, and I hope as many of you as possible will help us do that.
Okay, we'll try Mina Bowater one more time. Mina, can you unmute and put your camera on, please? We see some action here.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you now. It's great to hear you, Mina.
Look,
Sorry you
I
had
can
so much
see
difficulty.
myself. I've pressed a bar. Anyway, listen, Zia, I just want to say how marvelous it is that you're speaking to us. But what a huge problem this is. I'm a great follower of Melanie Phillips, and I believe I'm a member of her Substack and everything, and she tries to counter the ridiculous propaganda that it's like the driver of this hate. And my problem is that I have, for instance, a wonderful article, would you believe, that was written by an Australian called Henry Ergas, who is an open exercise letter in distorting history, which challenges from the rivers to the sea, and the trope is that Israel kicked all the Palestinians off the land when they took the land of Israel. It is a downright lie. It's more complex, I grant you, but when you have something like that so clearly and so truthfully exposed, and yet I've even forwarded that letter to the BBC. Can I get anybody to think that they might, for instance, preface when they talk about rivers to the sea, give the other side? Because this is the problem. The truth is that the Arabs all united to exterminate every Palestinian
Mina, can
Jew.
you ask the question, please?
Well, the question is, how would reform try to do its best to defeat the propaganda coming out of our own BBC Broadcasting Corporation?
Yeah, great question. And it's something I've thought about a lot because, as someone I'm an entrepreneur. So firstly, again, totally hear you. I think the manner in which the BBC has covered events in the Middle East in recent years has been, on average, appalling. And I think there's some very notable examples where you can, I think any dispassionate observer would be able to say that there was this very significant bias that impacted public opinion in this country, which is to the BBC's shame. Now, I am personally, this is my personal view as someone who's an entrepreneur, I love building things. I know that building things is much more difficult than tearing things down and destroying them, right? And there are so many things I loved about the BBC. I love The Office. I love lots of the great BBC shows that probably wouldn't have been made by any other broadcaster. I think the way the news coverage works now, I think is hugely a big issue. Now, again, how do you solve that? I don't know whether government legislation is the way that you solve those things. I think it's a question of culture. Part of me thinks there is some way that we could create a bit of a reboot in the culture, and particularly in the newsroom. Again, it comes down to it comes into leadership. It comes down to management. And I agree with you. If there is this sense, the whole point of the BBC, and one of the reasons I would argue it is still, I've spent a lot of time in America. What I will still say is that if you look at how partisan some of the American news channels have become, sometimes, in comparison to those, switching on the BBC about certain events in the world, not the Middle East, but other issues, does seem a little bit more reasonable and balanced. So part of me thinks that there is some hope. I could be wrong about this, and again, this is my own opinion. I just worry about tearing down an institution like the BBC for a country like us. I think the watermark is very high to do that. And so my view is that, well, at least I hope, and maybe this is naive, that there's a way that that culture in the newsroom can be rebooted with the right management team, so that we have a situation where events, both current and historical context, are portrayed in a reasonable way. And that can include bringing guests on, of course, to guests and commentators to be able to articulate those things. But those slogan, those chants are from the river to the sea. Again, from a legislative and legal and policing standpoint, I don't think there's any doubt when people make that chant, when they're chanting that, what they mean. Right? I don't think there's any doubt about that. And yet, when you look at the way that that is policed, it is policed on the basis that it doesn't mean the thing that it very obviously does mean to the people who chant it. And, if I would again ask all of you, how many of you feel threatened by such a chant, particularly when it's coming from a large group of pretty aggressive people? I can only imagine what that might feel like. So again, I'm wary of saying that there's some broadly. I think when you got to think very carefully about second and third order effects when you legislate. But I think that the point that you're making there is a very valid one, and I think the answer is we need a reboot in the culture, and we need new leadership inside the BBC newsroom. That's what my personal opinion would be. I know there are some people in Reform who say scrap the license fee and to hell with them, and let them go whatever way the markets, let them get swept away with the markets. Maybe I'm a bit sentimental because I love some of the old BBC shows, but I love Britain, and I think that it would be a shame if we didn't at least try. But that's my opinion.
Thank you, Sia. Barry Epstein is next. Barry, if you could come off mute, and if we can see you, open your camera. And after Barry will be Leonid Yanovich, and after him, Lance Foreman. Barry. Barry?
Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you, Barry. Can you turn your camera on if possible?
It is on if you can flick me up, Jerry.
Don't worry too much if you can't. If you could ask your question, please.
Okay. Zia, thank you for the presentation. When I was a young man, very young man, I used to go to Hyde Park Corner every Sunday to listen to the debates. And I asked a policeman one day, officer, what are the only things that cannot be said at Hyde Park Corner? And he said, young man, you're not allowed to attack the personage of the head of state. They are above politics. You cannot preach sedition, and you cannot preach incitement to hate. All of those were arrestable offences. Why does that no longer hold true?
One amazing question. The fact that you mentioned sedition there is super interesting to me, because I get asked about what about these people advocating for Sharia law and things in this country, and again, if you are, and I don't know if that's the context in which of the question, but it's certainly something that I get asked about a lot, and I think it's a very important question for anyone seeking political office in this country to have an answer to. And again, I think carefully about Reform. We're quite thoughtful about legislation and making sure that we're thinking about second and third order effects and unintended consequences. I think that anyone who, so my basic response is, if there is someone in this country advocating for sedition, the tearing down of our English common law system to be replaced by some foreign system, I don't think that, I think if there is a sense of advocacy for that, which reaches a certain threshold, then I think that is sedition. And I assumed that was illegal, Barry, but it's not. It was one of the last things that Gordon Brown did, was remove that from the statute books, so that it was no longer illegal to advocate for full sedition. So I personally think that is a problem. I really do. And that would be my answer to that issue. You know, beyond that, I think that you know, not criticizing the monarch, I'm all right with that. But I think that being realistic, you know, probably people are going to have their own views about that. But I think the most important thing for me anyway, that certainly got my attention, was that point about sedition. And I think this country has lost the thread as to why that is so critically important, because in the end, so often it's about balancing competing concerns, right? And so obviously, you know, freedom of religion is a vital common law principle. And as soon as a government starts legislating against a religion, or for a religion for that matter, it's only a matter of time, once whatever other government comes in, that same law will then be weaponized in a different way. But I think that the sedition point is a really crucial one. And I think that if and I also think, by the way, people going out and advocating for such things is deeply unhelpful for the social fabric in this country. I can think of little. I mean, if you look at the things that often go viral on social media, it is some lunatic imam, you know, preaching some nonsense about trying to make the UK a caliphate or something, right? And it's like, well, these are things that don't do anybody, including Muslims, by the way, any favors whatsoever. So I'm glad you raised that question, and it strikes at the heart. I mean, sadly, you know, Speaker's Corner is not quite the you know, its relative influence in terms of the public square that is declined, and as I said, the new public square is social media. But I think we have to think very carefully if we want to think about how this country endures for the next 100 years. You know, what is this country like for our children's children and their children? If we are not thinking about such things, this country will go to a very difficult place very quickly.
Thank you, Zia. Leonid Yanovich.
Thank you. And thank you, Zia, for coming to talk to us. My question is, will the reforms manifesto include the following? Repealing acts and regulations since Tony Blair's government, starting from the Equalities Act, and regulations that slow down business and entrepreneurship, leave ECHR, prescribe IRGC and Muslim Brotherhood, take control of what's being preached in mosques across the country, repeal the Islamophobia definition if it was made by the Labour, crack down on the infiltration of Islamists and clans in the Home Office, housing associations, and other bodies, crack down on Charity Commission, which isn't doing its job, and lets Islamist charities off the hook, ban pro-Palestinian hate marches, ban DEI in all public organizations, remove the pull factor.
Rather long list, Leonid. I don't know if Zia is going to remember. If we can give,
all right, let me go through some of those.
Yeah.
So, you know, number one, in terms of the big sweeping, I gave an interview with The Economist a couple of days ago. It hasn't come out yet. Let's see how they portray it. But you know, they were very interested in what Nigel's first, you know, term would look like, and what, you know, what our priorities would be. And yes, a large amount of the work we have to do is undoing the trampling of our constitution that was done by Tony Blair. That there's a huge amount of work to be done in doing that. In terms of repealing things like you know, the DEI programs, absolutely. We're committed to that. In terms of repealing the Equality Act, absolutely. Again, it's kind of Orwellian name. I want to be clear, though. What we're not saying is that reform government is cool with, you know, an employer firing someone, or, you know, not employing someone based on an immutable characteristic, right? Or, you know, choosing to fire somebody because of their religion. Of course, we're not advocating for that. But the Equality Act has been now, again, massive overreach, weaponized to the nth degree. So we are going to have to repeal that and replace it with again the correct level of protection, so that the things I just mentioned cannot happen. I think the point about prescribed organizations, absolutely, we need to take a very good look at these prescribed at these organizations. What are they advocating for? What are their goals? Who is involved? And make sure that standards are upheld. And probably there will be a lot more prescribed, or certainly more prescribed organizations. The majority of MI5's caseload are Islamist, are potential Islamist terrorists, right? That is just a fact. That's not a subjective aspersion. So we have to look at that. I totally agree. The Charity Commission is not doing its job. And, you know, I've already referenced, even prior to your question, concern that I have myself as a Muslim about some of these nutters who are preaching crazy stuff, totally unchallenged and totally, unencumbered by law enforcement. And, you know, I say this too, if I was talking to, a group of Muslims, what ends up happening is, so I would say the same thing. And what I would say is that it's not even, it doesn't even do service for Muslims in this country to allow for some Islamophobia definition to come in, or to allow these imams to preach some of this insane stuff that we've seen. Again, not all imams, but there definitely are examples where they're preaching anti-Semitic things, or advocating for Sharia law or caliphates or whatever it might be, without consequence of the law. And it's anyone who has taught a class, or understands psychology, will tell you that the surefire way, if you want to get a kid bullied by their peers in a classroom, how do you do it? You give them demonstrable, preferable treatment over the other children, in front of the other children, right? And so that resentment keeps building. We don't yet have this Islamophobia definition. I think odds on it will come in before the next general election. And yeah, you can be absolutely sure that one of the first things a reform government will do will be to repeal that, because we cannot have a situation. It absolutely is a blasphemy law. Even calling it a blasphemy law by the back door, by the way, isn't quite doing it justice, because that implies that it's a criticism of God in general, but it's actually the criticism of a particular religion. And the sad part about all of this is that the reason why all of this is even on the cards is not even because of some ideological reason from the cabinet ministers who were proposing it, but just out of pure cold political calculation in their eyes, right? And that's the sad thing. So hopefully that answers your question. We're committed to undoing the monstrosities that Tony Blair leveled on this country, and we're going to be looking very carefully at all of those other things too.
Thank you, Zia. Lance Foreman, you come off mute, Lance, please.
There we go. Thank you. Zia, really appreciate you coming on. It's really valuable to have your insights, so thank you. My question is also about anti-Semitism, and you are absolutely right to say that it's rife on social media. But as Mina quite correctly said, it's the BBC have been playing this game for about 25 years now. This is nothing new, and indeed, it's very much my view that if Hamas and other terrorist groups weren't aware that they'd have the support of the mainstream media, they could never succeed, because militarily they would fail. Yeah. There is a sort of implicit partnership going on, and the BBC are behaving terribly. Having said that, the two areas where I believe that anti-Semitism is most rife in the UK is partly from the far left, or the woke left, but also very much from the Muslim community. And there are two things I would say. First of all, you're probably familiar with Mehdi Hassan. He's very big on social media.
Unfortunately, I am. Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. He wrote a piece in the New Statesman about 10 years ago, and these were his words. He said, "Anti-Semitism in the British Muslim community is, in inverted commas, our dirty little secret." And then just recently, a year ago, there was a poll, and 75% of British Muslims don't think that Israel should exist. Now, I find this tragic because Israel is building very good relations with its Arab neighbors through the Abraham Accords. And, I don't know how we deal with this. Is it something reform can deal with, or is this something that the Muslim community in the UK needs to deal with? Because, it shouldn't be like this. So I just would like your thoughts on that.
Yeah, look, great points. So just to address them in order, look, I didn't mention this because there was also a previous question about the BBC. I mean, the fact that BBC still can't bring themselves to call Hamas a terrorist organization is so unfathomably disgusting and stupid. It makes your blood boil, right? I mean, I just don't know. I mean, again, if ever you talk about bellwethers for how corrupted the newsroom is, I think it's an absolute disgrace. I think it's an absolute disgrace that is the case. And there is no doubt that that has an impact, I think, on public perception. I think your second point is an important one because, again, the danger and the risk is we get super reductive with these things, right? And so let's say the BBC did now call Hamas a terrorist organization. That's not going to resolve anti-Semitism and totally flip things overnight. Obviously, it's important. It is important, but these are major issues. So, look, I would say a few things. Number one, absolutely. I mean, look at what, thanks to President Trump, by the way, and Jared Kushner, in no small part, there was enormous progress in the normalization of relations between Israel and many countries, and even Saudi would have been done, actually, were it not for, and Biden was stupid to throw that in the bin. He basically torched that. And I'm hopeful that all of that can be revivified again. I think if you look at the UK, look, I'm not hugely bullish on the extrapolation of some of these polls. I've looked at them. I'm not saying there's no signal. There's definitely signal there, but I wouldn't get too disconsolate on the basis that they're relatively small sample sizes. The way the questions are asked. I mean, I think that this country definitely has an issue with the sorts of people that have been imported into this country, right? I mean, my parents are Muslim. They think Israel has a right to exist and should exist. And partly because my parents, are different sorts of people, I think, to the types that are coming in from certain communities, from some communities in Pakistan and Afghanistan that have a much lower. So, two things. But also, my parents came here at a time when net migration was like 30 to 50,000 a year, and now we have a situation where the numbers are exponentially higher. The sort of people coming are exponentially less, have a vastly lower propensity to assimilate, to the point where some of these communities, and again, not all of them, but some of these communities are not, not even learning English, and so again, so if you zoom out a little bit, this is why we say we need to go almost back to the drawing board with our immigration policy. Also, we haven't really talked about schools and the education system here, but I'm afraid, just like the universities, I mean, Blair said he wanted 50% of kids to go to university. And, fat lot of good that's done. A lot of them, sadly, they're just getting saddled with enormous amounts of debt for degrees that are not making them any more employable. Some of these degrees are literally making them less employable if you look at the data. And they're indoctrination camps. They are indoctrination camps. And if you want to find hotbeds of anti-Semitism, I would point you to, sadly, some of the campuses of some of these Russell Group universities. I think we all know this. So again, how do we solve that problem? There isn't like one piece of legislation that a reform government can just bring and magic that. Again, some of these are cultural issues, but let's go through some of them. Number one, let's deport people who are in this country illegally, all of them. Number one, that's an important thing to do. Let's halt migration for a certain period of time. Let's think very carefully about the sorts of people we want to have in this country. If you're going to come to this country and contribute both economically and culturally, and want to be part of this country and live by our values, then assuming we have space, which I don't think we will for a number of years, but at some point we will. We're not zero migration forever. Then we will think about those things. But then we also have to apply the law evenly. We have to apply the law evenly so that people who are, advocating you know, as I said, some of the things we've talked about here, where, you know, any reasonable person will say that that is not acceptable. The law is applied evenly. And I think if you do those things, and that is coupled with this sense of a renewed sense of national pride, that, as I said, can transcend, because that's the other risk and the danger here, right? We get really drawn into these, which is very leftist sort of thing, right? You know, this community and that community being pitted against each other. These are the things that we must do. They're not easy, and they will take time. But I genuinely do think it can be done. You know, we had a question earlier about things like the Charity Commission, and just look at the amount of taxpayer money that goes into things that actively work against the interests of the British people, actively work against that actively. You know, there was a comment earlier about some of these groups inside the Home Office and things like that. You know, literally inside British institutions. And again, not all of them. I don't want to catastrophize here, but there definitely are examples of where some of these groups funded by the taxpayer are just obviously anti-Semitic, right? So I think that these are some of the most important questions of our time in this country. I'm certainly not claiming it's easy. It's one reason I back Nigel, because I think you need a singular kind of generational talent to be able to change culture in this country. But I think if we do all of those things I just mentioned, I think we got a real shot. We got a real shot of ameliorating the situation and making it a place that your kids and grandkids would feel not just safe, but excited to grow up in.
Thank you, Zia. Joanne Schiefer, and then after Joanne, it will be Benjamin Tamba and Felix Ahrens. Joanne, you come off mute, please. Hi, Joanne.
Hi, thanks. I've got two questions, if that's permissible.
Quick, yes.
They're very quick. One of them is quite similar to the question that Jean asked. So first of all, thank you, Zia, for coming to speak to us. So my first question was, despite reform only having a handful of MPs, I think Nigel Farage has the ability to lead the conversation and drive the political agenda. What practical steps can be taken now to support the Jewish community and combat anti-Semitism? Because 4 years is a very long time.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear that question a lot. You know, the 4 years is a long time. Hopefully, it will be less than 4 years. I think there's a real increasing chance it'll be less than that. But I take your point. Look, I think what we will do is to keep doing what we're doing, which is highlighting. Look, Nigel is the biggest political voice in the country. He's a bigger political voice even than the Prime Minister now, and he will use that voice to ensure that, you know, that there are corrections on the narrative where it is necessary. So when no one's talking about the hostages, Nigel will talk about the hostages. When no one's talking about, you know, the invaluable contribution of the Jewish community in this country, and how unsafe they feel, in no small part because of the way policing is done, Nigel will highlight that. Now, I want to be honest. That pales in comparison to what he and we are going to be able to do when he's the Prime Minister, flanked by hopefully 400 turquoise-blooded Reform MPs. I don't want to, you know, I don't want to misrepresent that. But what he can do, as I said, is what he is doing, which is continuing to articulate and make that case, which becomes all the more important given the totally one-sided and frankly very performative behavior of this current government, right? I think Nigel's voice is very, very important. I hear you that it feels like some time away. All I will say to you is that you know, the night's darkest just before the dawn. You know, as quickly, you know, as I am very optimistic that things can start to turn around in many ways very quickly. Now, that doesn't mean we get to the, you know, to this incredible place in a very short period of time. But I think just giving people this sense that things are no longer getting worse, right? That common sense is returning and that things are starting to improve a little bit. I mean, we know this in the arc of our own lives, that as human beings, that's the thing that we're most attached to is the rate of change and the direction travel, right? And I'm very confident that even in Nigel's first 60 to 100 days as Prime Minister, you will start to see that change. But in the meantime, he will continue to advocate and use his voice to ensure that, as I said, some of the total misrepresentations are corrected, and the Jewish community has a voice on the national stage.
Thank you, Zia. Benjamin Tamba, and then Felix Ahrens, and then Sue Baumgart. Benjamin, could you come off mute, please?
Hello.
Hello,
Sir.
Benjamin.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Please, Palestinianism is nothing but Islamic Nazism that was started by Yasser Arafat. The Americans have started telling their children the truth. Marco Rubio has banned Mahmoud Abbas from coming to the UN because he has seen the list of how they pay Palestinians to kill Jews. Their mission is not to look for a state. They are there to kill Jews. They don't want a state. When is the British politicians, all of you, Labour, Reform, Conservative, when are you going to start telling the British public this truth? Because the Americans have already started telling their children the truth.
Okay, thank you, Benjamin. Zia.
Yeah, well, look, I think this goes back to what we just talked about, the fact that the BBC will not describe Hamas as a terrorist organization. And I was on Newsnight a few weeks ago, maybe a couple of weeks ago, and I made the point, how can a ceasefire and a peace deal be done? How can a sustainable peace be achieved with an organization whose founding documents literally state that Israel is illegitimate, lacks any right to exist, and must be exterminated? I mean, that is literally in Hamas's, it's not a conspiracy theory, it's literally in the founding documents. And so, to which there wasn't really any response from any of the other guests or the host, as you would expect. So look, I think that there is a fundamental issue with regards to understanding the nature of what Israel is up against in this war. And I think a lot of this stuff, in my view, is connected. Sadly, in the sense that Israel obviously feels incredibly besieged, and I think, frankly, even Britain's influence with the Israeli government now is negligible to zero. In no small part, again, because it's they have these extraordinarily performative things where they say they are they're withholding certain military spare parts or something like that, in order to appease certain elements that they think are important from an electoral perspective. So I think the most important thing is that there is an honest discussion about these issues, and that things are not misrepresented. And I think failing to describe, choosing very consciously, forbidding your journalists to describe Hamas as a terrorist organization is emblematic of how.
No, the whole Palestinian project.
Okay, Benjamin, it's okay. We've got to move on. Felix Ahrens. Felix.
Yeah. No, thank you both, Gary, for the opportunity, and Zia for your extensive introduction. I was a bit concerned when I listened to you, and when it touched a bit on curbing freedom of speech, where you acknowledged that there were limitations. I think there are limitations, but they are immediately linked to other laws. So people libel and slander, incitement to violence, and just harassment. So in your example, when people would shout at an elderly couple, that is a form of harassment. That is not so much that you would deny them the freedom of speech, because they could probably say, and they should probably say, what they want in a polite conversation, but the manner and the threatening attitude with which it goes, I think, and maybe I'm a purist here but I think that's not about freedom of speech. And I think this whole discourse quite often retreats into that rather polarizing notion of freedom of speech, where it's actually about, like you also mentioned throughout, that is about upholding the law, but mainly other laws, namely that people are protected from harassment, from incitement to violence, and all these kind of things, which ultimately comes down to also what you say about the governance in BBC and throughout maybe universities.
Felix,
So
what's your question?
my
Felix?
question is, do you, other than a focus on freedom of speech or trying to police on outcomes, focus on what drives people and also not to uphold those laws and to the underlying ideas, rather patronizing that society seeks these focuses rather than only steer on the outcomes that we don't like being shouted at, which I could live with if those other if we knew that things would be followed up where it hurts more. Sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Zia.
Yeah. So just to be clear, I actually agree with what you just said. And so if I wasn't clear before, when I was referring to that incident, which I think you've all probably seen, that footage of some men shouting. I think they had the Palestinian flag on their car, and they were hurling abuse at some elderly Jewish people. I was referring then to two-tier policing. I wasn't saying that people should be, obviously we are talking about speech there, but I agree with you. Broadly, Reform think there are far too many laws in this country. The country needs fewer laws, but we actually need the laws that are there, the laws that remain, to be upheld, number one, and enforced, and to be applied evenly. So I agree with that assessment. And my comments, just to be clear in terms of social media, I'm not advocating for mass censorship of social media. I'm simply articulating, I think, a valid concern, and I think that one that a lot of you share. About how difficult moderation on social media is. And again, I would say this as a tech person, one way I would propose that we resolve these issues is giving users the ability to choose for themselves, the outer boundaries of the sort of content that they want to see. So, Gary, I can take a couple more.
Okay. Sue Baumgart.
No, thank you. I've been really worried by what I've heard here tonight because I have heard this witch hunt against the BBC when actually, if you watch Channel 4 News every night, they have done deep coverage, much bigger than the BBC, of the war in Gaza and what's going on the West Bank in Israel. So if you watch that you could define it as much more anti-Israel, although it's not anti-Semitic. It's looking at what's going on with a particular viewpoint. The other thing I've heard tonight is about almost like Netanyahu is this wonderful savior of Israel, when in fact, in Israel, there is huge political dissent, and he is stopping a lot. He and his government are stopping a lot of comments and political activity. Those two things aside that have really bugged me to listen to tonight, my question to you is, I find it quite ironic that you, belonging to a party like Reform and Nigel Farage, for me, it's a party, even when it was UKIP, has fomented masses of hatred and dissent in the country. But for ages and ages, if you look at the demonstrations that have happened outside the hotels, but the immigration hotels, places where we've got nowhere, when people come over, we've got to put them somewhere temporarily or whatever. They have to go somewhere. We can't have them on the street in a tent in a park. So they've gone there. And because one or two, in that case, one person has committed a very horrible crime, there's a mob, and it is a mob outside the hotel trying to, I don't know, it's just horrible.
Okay, Sue, what's your question then?
My question, which I've asked, is I can't understand, how can you defend Reform when, for me, it goes to the lowest common denominator and just tries to get a lot of hatred and nastiness? We should be trying to get peace and understanding and compassion and empathy in this country. And Reform isn't doing that. And Nigel Farage never has.
Okay, so let's cover a few of those things, Sue. So you use the word empathy, and so what is empathy? It is trying to listen to people whom you're interfacing with and trying to understand where they're coming from, what their concerns are, what motivates them. And I would argue it is in no small part because Nigel and Reform have done just that with vast amounts of, really, I would argue, the silent majority in this country, who are lovely, law-abiding, warm-hearted, generous, warm-spirited people, the kind of people, by the way, who welcomed my parents to this country in the early 1980s. But frankly, whose patience is wearing thin and is getting thinner, and feel like their welcoming nature has been taken advantage of. And what Reform is doing is listening to those people, is taking on board those concerns and doing our best to offer practical solutions as to how we solve the problem. I would argue that while anytime there are any form of large protests, there are going to be a small fringe that do unacceptable things. The vast majority of the people who were protesting there were peaceful. A lot of them were mums worried about their kids. And by the way, they were not protesting against the migrants in the hotels. They were protesting government policy. And this is what happens if you talk to these people. They harbor no, the baseline view that they have is that we have had a government that is deliberately subordinated the interests of British people and made them second-class citizens in their own country, and made them pay for the privilege. And so that is how I would characterize, and I think is a reasonable characterization of those protests. And by the way, Nigel, nobody in this country has done more in our lifetimes to frankly eradicate the actual far right in this country than Nigel. He did it with Nick Griffin and the BNP when they were polling at very high levels. And Nigel spoke to those voters and said, you don't need to go there in order to get your voices heard. And you mentioned previously, we talked about UKIP. This is new. UKIP still exists. Nigel left UKIP for very, very specific reasons. I don't think I've spent more time with another human, more than I have Nigel, over the last 14 months. So more time with him than anyone else. And I will tell you, he is he is incredibly warm-hearted, and he loves this country and he loves everyone in this country. So I disagree with the characterizations. You're obviously entitled to your view, but I would actually say that no one, and I think again any reasonable, dispassionate observer would say that nobody has done more to eradicate the actual far right in this country than him.
Ed Moss. Oh, sorry. Ed Moss.
Oh, good evening. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Lovely. Good evening, Zia. Delighted to meet you. Thank you very much indeed. Just really sort of a more broad one, and I'm sure people will cringe when I say this, but Jeremy Corbyn representing Islington, and Richard Bergen representing East Leeds, Zara Sultana representing Coventry, although she has signs on Birmingham. They're paid £94,000 a year as public servants, and they, along with the likes of I live in Bolton, and my local councillor, the head of the Conservatives, is a gentleman called Nadim Muslim, who is a lovely man. They're busy spending their £94,000 a year on social media, not discussing what their constituents need. And I'm one of their constituents. Let's say people like me are their constituents. My local councillor, when are they going to stop that? You report them to parliamentary standards and nothing happens. Is there any chance of an improvement there? Secondly, why does Nadim, as leader of the council, as leader of the Conservative group, why should he, as a councillor who is paid to represent his constituents, receive death threats because he has the temerity to say that Bolton first, international things secondly? You know, that's just not right. And then finally, this covered head business on marches, that affects everybody, not just the Jewish community. It affects the Muslim community and the Sikhs and everybody else. Why is that not being put a stop to? And can you do something about that should you get to power?
Zia.
Yeah. Well, look, the first 2 points, I think that there are obviously a lot of concerns about that many people have about some of the characters that you mentioned. That is democracy, and it's democracy at work, and we're all entitled to take great exception to the things that those people articulate. I think that to your point about the face coverings, I mean, look, we've been clear. So, well, let me be clear. I have been clear, as of some of the other MPs, that we think face coverings in public in Britain should be banned. And I say that one, because to the degree it applies to the burqa, I would argue that in a Western liberal democracy, human interaction is critical for social cohesion, and in a Western liberal democracy, human interaction is in no small part facial, right? It is hugely important, and so that's one aspect. But then also there's this public safety aspect, and I say this as someone who spends a lot of time with Nigel. Obviously, there's a level of threat against me. There's a much higher level of threat against Nigel, as you can imagine, and I have seen masked Antifa thugs literally intimidate, just regular people trying to come to a reform event. And one of them knocked a tooth out of one of Nigel's security detail. No arrests made. Police, from what I could tell, sadly, couldn't really care less. And those Antifa thugs were wearing face masks. But also, if you're walking down any busy street and you see somebody wearing a face mask and a hoodie, what do? I'll tell you what you do. You cross the road, right? And I don't think people should be forced into that level of menace. And given how much CCTV there is in this country, again, we have this crazy situation in this country where the law only applies to people who choose to abide by the law, if you see what I mean, right? So people can walk around with face masks and basically opt out of being observed and surveilled in the way that we are all surveilled whenever we walk down the street. So, that's certainly my view. I think that it's I think it is the right thing to ban face coverings in public.
And can I persuade you, Zia, to take just one more question?
Sure. Yeah.
Michael Goldberg, you'll be the last person. Michael, could you come off mute, please, Michael?
We're off mute and camera as well. It's Michael and Sharon.
Okay.
Hi guys. Just quick questions. The elephant in the room is the civil service, the College of Policing, and the unions. Those are things that are immutable. How are you going to deal with them? That's it from us.
Yeah, so sorry. So it was the civil service, the police, and
you've got the College of Policing and the unions, all which have hogtied Labour and everyone else who's ever tried to do anything.
Yeah. So look, I think we've got to take each of those in turn, and I think we've got to be we consider ourselves a very practical party. So if you were to look at unions. We're not necessarily pro or anti unions writ large, right? I think that for medical doctors, and I say this as someone whose father's a doctor, whose mum's a nurse, whose brother's a doctor, right? So the NHS is very close to my heart. I don't think NHS doctors should just be able to go on strike because of the nature of the critical nature of the work that they do. So that would be one example that I don't think that should be possible. If you look at the situation in Birmingham where bins are not being collected, I think I would zoom out a little bit. This is my personal view and say one of the issues we have in this country is a sense of how unfair it is that there seems to be infinite money available for people turning up on our beaches uninvited on a daily basis, but not enough money to pay people who wake up before the crack of dawn to collect bins. So I'm not necessarily in the camp of someone who would condemn the people who would say that those people who actually graft. I mean, let's not even talk about the people abusing our welfare system, and choosing consciously not to work when they can work, and then people who again want to wake up before the crack of dawn and do really difficult work that many people would not want to do. So I think the union point again, we're going to be very practical. Nigel's already said with the teachers' union. I mean, my Lord, we're gonna have a war on our hands there because the schools these days are indoctrination camps. And Nigel said, "Bring it on," and you can be assured that he means it. So do you know what I mean? We've got to be very practical about these things and take each thing on their merits. Again, I am of the view that a country that gives £15 billion a year still in foreign aid, but doesn't have a few extra quid an hour to pay people collecting bins in Birmingham, I find that very difficult. To make a case that we should be condemning the bin men particularly when you look at how much corruption there is in councils. In terms of the civil service, look, I've already been pretty public about this. I think we're going to have to fire the majority of civil servants. I really do. And that's not to say there won't be some challenges that come from that, but the status quo will be far, far worse. It will be far, far worse. I think that modern technology can automate a lot of these functions, but I don't think we have a choice. Sadly, so a few things also need to happen, right? So one of the reasons why civil servants have become so empowered is because the idea is, well, this is the professional management class. They're the ones who can do long-term projects. Because ministers come and go, and like my lord of ministers come and gone over the last 15 years. I mean, we had 3 chancellors in a week. How many prime ministers did we get through in a certain number of years, right? So number one, a reform government will bring stability in that cabinet, right? So the ministers won't be disappearing every now and again. We will come to power with a plan. That is what we are working on already. But yes, I think we are going to have. I mean, just look at how much the civil service has ballooned in payroll. I think payroll has increased about 60% over the last 8-9 years. And the amount of money being spent on outsourced consultancies has also skyrocketed. And what are people getting in return? Productivity is pretty much as low as it's been on record, right? And then the police, look, I think, again, that's a very difficult problem. We've already started some work on that. I think the vast majority of police officers just work really hard and do very, very difficult work under very difficult circumstances. And almost everything they do these days is heavily politicized, and everyone's got a smartphone in front of them waiting for a single, they all have to do their jobs knowing that, that fraction of a second of lack of judgment that they might show in any given situation under stress might end up being something that trends all around the world. And we can only imagine what that might be like. I think we need to pay police officers more. We need a much more talent. We need to get rid of these crazy DEI woke things that make it, that make it very difficult for people who have certain immutable characteristics to even get into the police force. And we need, courageous management with the right incentives, and their incentives will not be filling out lots of diversity paperwork or going to pride marches. It will be identifying, arresting criminals, and gathering enough evidence to ensure that they're sent to jail. It's as simple as that.
Thank you so much, Zia. I'm going to ask our Managing Director, Steve Winston, to propose a vote of thanks. But first, I just want to remind you that our next meeting is Thursday week, 11th of September, where our guest speaker is Mark Regev, who many of you will remember as the former Israeli ambassador to the UK. Steve.
Well, yes, Zia, thank you very much. On behalf of all of us here at the NJA, you've taken an evening out to hear and answer, very satisfactorily some very challenging questions. As you can see, the audience here is a mixed bag. Some of us are very supportive of Reform UK, some of us are unsure, some of us are opposed, but you have done a wonderful job of answering some very challenging questions. So on behalf of all of us, I'd like to thank you very sincerely for that. And I know that you've got the Reform UK conference coming up this weekend. So again, on behalf of us all, we wish you all the luck for that. We hope that it remains a safe and respectful platform for Reform UK to do their work. And just thank you on behalf of all of us. It's been a pleasure hearing from you. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Have a lovely evening, Zia.
Have a good night, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.